Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last episode, we talked about the rise of the cowboy and ultimately the fall of the cowboy, but also how the government approached Native Americans as the country moved westward. We're going to resume our story of how settlers approached life and the challenges that faced them as we discuss episode 3, American Populism. So, dear student, incline your ear and hear our stories so that you may find your place among his delight. We have two objectives today. You should be able to, number 8, identify the problems that farmers faced and their cooperative efforts to solve them. And number 9, explain the rise of the Populist Party. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 8. Farmers united together to address problems that were kind of unique in the agricultural West, but common to all of the agricultural Westerners. In subpoint A, by the late 1800s, many farmers were trapped in this really bad economic cycle. Crop prices had been falling, so when farmers were producing food and taking it to market, they were making less money than they had ever had. So crop prices were falling. In an effort to go buy more land to grow more crops, so thus to try to if you're not making as much money per bushel of grain, then the way you can make more money is to just produce more bushels of grain. But to do that, you need more land, so they were heading basically into debt, mortgaging their farms to go take on larger plots of land. But as they did that, crop prices continued to fall, which meant that every bushel they grew was less profitable than the last. And so the lenders, the people who loaned the farms money, were in repossessions and basically foreclosures. And foreclosures had been increasing when farmers couldn't make those loan payments, and so the banks began taking back their capital in terms of taking back their land. While that was happening, railroad prices for shipping goods were particularly high, so even if you could produce food and could sell it at market, just getting it to the market was an expensive proposition, and those things conspired with each other to really put farmers in an awkward and unavoidable economic position. In the Civil War, in the area of the Civil War, the United States had issued somewhere around $500 million in what were called greenbacks. Greenbacks were just paper money, kind of like paper money that we use today, but it was paper money that could not be exchanged for silver or gold. This was a change in the way that banking had been operating, or that currency had been operating in the United States, where every dollar bill, the paper dollar, was redeemable for $1 worth of silver or gold. In the Civil War, basically with currency shortages, the government just started printing paper money with the promise that it would be worth $1, but you couldn't take it to a reserve bank and go exchange it for that amount of precious metal. The greenbacks then became worth less than hard money. I mean, if you were a merchant, you'd say well, I could take paper money that's worth silver or gold and I could go exchange it as like a bill of exchange, or this piece of paper that's just a promise that it's worth amount of money. Merchants would take the greenbacks, but they would only take it if they gave more of them. That kind of tried to mitigate the risk of the merchants. So the greenbacks became worth less than hard money of the same value. Even though they were both printed for $1, only the dollars that could be exchanged for, coins or exchange for gold had any real value. After the Civil War, the government pulled those greenbacks out of circulation. Basically said, we're not using these anymore, we're going to return to a gold or silver receipt. That decreased the amount of currency in circulation. Okay, this is a little bit of supply and demand, and we're kind of getting deep into monetary policy, but it's worth knowing about. So during the Civil War, the government increased inflation by just creating more money. After the Civil War, they take that money out of circulation. That means that the remaining bills seem to be worth more because currency is rarer. So the value of the remaining currency grew. This is really just how supply and demand works. And so farmers who had borrowed money in the inflationary period, they had borrowed money when dollars were worth less, had to go pay back their loans when the dollars were worth more. The amount of the loan didn't change, but the availability to just get cash to pay it back got a lot harder. And it's not because of anything that the farmers did themselves, it's just the way that the monetary policy worked. Those things also conspired against farmers as well. At the same time, you got to remember they're receiving less and less money than they ever have for their crops. For example, between the years 1867 and 1887, in that 20-year period, the price of a bushel of wheat fell from $2 a bushel to 68 cents a bushel. That makes it exceedingly hard for farmers to ever get ahead. And so farmers basically begged the government, all these monetary policies are killing us. Please create some inflation and issue more money. Now, to a lot of people, the idea of inflation is not a good thing, right? Because if you go save $100 and put it in the bank, and then you have inflation where the money becomes worth less, your $100 just doesn't buy as much as it used to. Inflation seems to hurt savers. However, inflation is really good to borrowers, and in this case, the farmers were borrowing a certain amount of money, and to pay it back, the dollars needed to become more accessible. So they begged the government to go create inflation. Go just issue more money. Please come up with this. And in 1878, Congress passed an act called the Bland-Allison Act, and it required the government to buy and coin between $2 and $4 million worth of silver every month. The Bland-Allison Act was trying to approach inflationary issues by just saying, like, okay, the government will make more money. We're not going to do it by issuing greenbacks, but we will just find silver and coin it, and that way it'll produce inflation, and it'll make it easier for the farmers. But it actually wasn't enough to change the increase in the money supply. Like, we're talking about really macro problems, and the Bland-Allison Act just wasn't enough to fix it. Farmers were paying outrageously high prices to transport their grain. There weren't enough railroads to really create competition in the market. So it might actually cost more money to ship grain from the Dakotas to Minneapolis, which is a fairly short amount of land. It could have been more expensive to do that than to transport from Chicago to England by boat travel, like working up the canals and getting from the Great Lakes through a set of canals actually end up into the Atlantic Ocean. It was cheaper to send stuff from Chicago to England across an ocean by boat than it was to get from Minneapolis to the Dakotas, which is fairly short, by rail, because there just wasn't much rail infrastructure and not much competition to create there. Also, the railroads were creating these secret agreements with middlemen who were brokering how the freight was loaded between grain brokers and merchants, and those secret agreements allowed the railroads to control grain storage prices in an effort to get to the market, like it has to be stored in a grain elevator in the way, and those things were influencing the market prices of crops as well. And a lot of farmers who had been mortgaging their farms for credit to buy seed and supplies, the suppliers then charged high rates of interest, sometimes charging more on credit than they did for the cash purchases. So if you're a farmer and you have to go buy seed and farm equipment and you can't actually just go afford to go pay cash to the merchant, so you borrow money from the merchant. Basically, let me get the seed now and then I'll pay you back later. The seed merchants would charge different prices between a cash sale and a credit sale, which is not illegal, but it ends up hurting the farmers more. It's not even deceitful, but it just, again, continues to squeeze the farmers. Farmers were caught in this cycle that ended up that they were in more and more debt every year and really no path out of it. One movement to organize farmers to advocate for reform was a group known as the Patrons of Husbandry. The Patrons of Husbandry began in 1867, and it became popularly known as the Grange. Its original purpose was to provide a social outlet and an educational forum for isolated farm families. Remember, people out on the frontier lived pretty lonely lives out there, and so in an effort just let's go talk to other people, that's where the Patrons of Husbandry came out. But by the 1870s, the Grangers spent most of their time and energy on a movement to go fight the railroads. It went from a social organization to an economic cooperative. The Grange's battle plan included teaching its members how to organize collective action, how to set up farmers cooperatives, how to sponsor state legislation to go get bills before the Congress on how to regulate railroads. There was another group known as the Farmers Alliance. And the Farmers Alliance, they were similar groups to mobilize on farm issues as well. The Farmers Alliance sent lecturers from town to town on topics like lower interest rates or loans or government control over railroads and banks. While the Grange ended up going from a social group into a legislative action group, the Farmers Alliance was always an educational piece as its main part. And they would bring spellbinding speakers. For instance, Mary Elizabeth Lease, one of the first women attorneys in America, she helped get the message across the country. She was a Kansas political agitator, so she's a homegrown Kansas product, and she basically says that farmers are being lackeys in the trade, and they're being the victims, and she urged farmers, like her line was, farmers should raise less corn and more hell. Go agitate for social change. And the membership grew from about 4 million people, mostly in the South and the West. The Farmers Alliance, the South and the West is kind of where their piece was, but 4 million adherents. And around 250,000 African Americans belong to the Colored National Farmers Alliance. Some alliance members, they were integrated black and white, but most members just accepted the segregation, and so like a parallel organization grows up for black farmers there. Roman numeral number 9. I want to talk about the rise of populism. The alliance movement developed into the populist political movement with what becomes known as the People's Party. The People's Party and the Populist Party, those terms are interchangeable, and we use both of them in the class. The People's Party in 1892 was an organization that used basically a populist political approach. Now, populism is a type of politics that always tries to speak for the lowest levels of society. It tries to represent the little guy. And the leaders of the alliance, they realized that if they were going to make really major political changes, they needed a base of political power. And so they used populism to reach it. It appeals to ordinary people who feel like their needs are being disregarded by the elites. The economic goals of the Populist Party included an increase in the money supply. Just create more cash. You'll make inflation that way, and that would produce a rise in the prices. That rise of prices for received goods and services. And while, like I said, inflation hurts people who are savers, inflation helps people who are borrowers. They also argued for a graduated income tax, that people who were wealthier should pay a larger percentage of their income than people who are poor. Those poor people should pay a smaller percentage of their income. The graduated income tax is actually what we use today. And they also argued for a federal loan program, that farmers should get economic relief in terms of loans, not from the free market of banks, but that the federal government could use its power of the purse to go help out farmers as well. It also had some political goals, and they would include things like electing United States senators by popular vote. Really until the populist movement, and then later championed by the progressive movement, U.S. senators were not chosen by an election. So the year that I'm recording this is an election year, and we're going to vote on a Kansas senator. Or a United States senator from Kansas. But it wasn't always like that. Actually, constitutionally, it was set up where the state would choose its senators. So people from, Topeka would go and choose who's going to be represent the state in the United States Senate. But they were arguing that had encased the upper house of Congress, the United States Senate, with basically traditional power brokers who never cared about the interest of ordinary people. Populists are very interested in the power of the ordinary people, so they argued for a move to United States senators being elected by popular vote. But also that the president and the vice president should only receive single terms. This is before our modern understanding of term limits, but we're like 2 terms of the president. That doesn't come out until like the Franklin Roosevelt era. We'll get there later. But they're arguing for single-term elections for the president and the vice president, and also the addition of a secret ballot. Now, we'll talk more about the secret ballot and how that plays out in a lot of different ways, but that voting should be an individual choice done with the protection of anonymity, that a person can go vote for whom they want, and they don't have to cast their vote publicly. That lets, ideally, voters make decisions that are even unpopular decisions, but to be able to do it of their own conscience. They also argued for an 8-hour workday. That political change at the level, and also restrictions on immigration, arguing that as immigrants were coming to the United States, they were competing for resources that were particularly hurting farmers. By 1892, populist candidates, it's a political party, right, the People's Party, populist candidates had won office at many levels of the government. They even got about 10% of the presidential vote. Although they were never a serious contender in presidential elections, they did make a lot of waves down in state and local levels. In the West, they elected 5 United States senators, 3 governors, and about 1,500 state legislatures, a number of them here in our home state of Kansas. Subpoint B, in February of 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt. This was pretty normal for railroads. They would hold a lot of power and could make investors in the railroad business a lot of wealth, but they always kind of skated along the edge of being fabulously wealthy or just bankruptingly poor. There's a lot of overhead in running a railroad, and it's an expensive proposition. It wasn't unusual for them to go out, like the one in February of 1893 when the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt. When that happened, that set off a cascade of 4 other railroads as going bankrupt. And the government's gold reserves, the government had been saving money, right? So gold reserves, they had been wearing thin because Congress had been in a pattern of big spending. And also there was a law that had required the Treasury to go buy silver from miners. So like that Bland-Allison Act, which was there to go create inflation in the supply. If they're using gold to go buy silver, I'm not sure that's really going to get you anywhere in the inflationary process, but they were doing that while silver was losing its value, so they're throwing good money after bad money. And as these big businesses were looking like they were going to fail, there was no business bigger than the railroads, and suddenly significant railroads are going out of business. As big businesses failed, the government looked like it was broke. People began to just panic. Those are, I think, good hallmarks, like if when you have a shaky political system and big business is going bad and government's going bad, like, oh man, go shore up your walls. And it sent off a financial panic. People panicked and they began stockpiling whatever gold they could get on their own. The panic jumped to Wall Street and the stock market crashed. And suddenly, abandoning silver, the price of silver fell, and it forced silver mines to close and silver miners to suddenly lose their jobs, and the problems just cascaded. By the end of the year, 15,000 businesses and 500 banks had totally collapsed. The panic deepened into depression and 3 million people lost their jobs. By December of 1894, a fifth of the workplace was unemployed. Subpoint C, when we discuss this question of silver or gold, to us moderns, this does not seem like an important decision, but the question of silver or gold, and I hope to vet it out for you a little bit, fascinated Americans, and everybody had an opinion on it. Political divisions that existed in the country were regional divisions. In the Northeast, business owners tended to be Republicans. In the South and in the West, farmers and laborers, where they're mostly located, tended to be Democrats. So you see like Republicans in the Northeast and the South and the West tended to be Democrats. In the election of 1892, the election centered on the future of the monetary system in the United States. Now again, this sounds honestly kind of super boring to us in our sensationalist era, like people arguing about monetary policy, but ordinary citizens at the turn of the century took this issue seriously in very careful debates. And we have essentially 2 groups that emerge out of it. On one side you have, they're sometimes called the Silverites. They favored bimetallism. Now, bimetallism is the idea that the government would issue paper money that could be redeemed for its value, not just in gold, but also in silver. Bimetallism, so the money could be used for 2 different types of precious metal. That would create inflation because you have basically a greater money supply to work with, and more dollars could enter circulation, and that would be good for debt holders. And they hoped that it would stimulate a weak economy. It would give poorer people an access into being able to buy things because there would be more money in circulation. The Democrats tended to be Silverites, but their presidential nominee in 1892 was Grover Cleveland, and Grover Cleveland was a gold bug. That brings us to our second group, the gold bugs. Gold bugs favored a gold standard, they backing dollars solely with the protection of gold. That had a higher value, but also a more stable value than silver did. Being a gold standard would limit inflation because gold was rare and there would be, fewer dollars would exist. That would produce a more stable economy, but it would also produce a more expensive currency. Now, Republicans at the time tended to favor gold. And in 1896, populists continued to support bimetallism. Grover Cleveland won that, and America tended to stay on the gold standard. In 1896, so the next election cycle, populists continued to support bimetallism. And in 1896, the Populist Party nominated a Democrat, actually, a Nebraska Democrat named William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan is one of my favorite people in American history, not because I totally love his policies, although, more or less, there's interesting ones in there. But I love William Jennings Bryan because of his style and his moxie. And he stays surprisingly relevant in American history for a surprisingly long time. A person that you might have never heard of had a tremendous amount of influence in American history. We're going to talk about William Jennings Bryan several more times. That's a name you want to remember. But he was a Democrat, but he was a populist-leaning Democrat. The way that I understand William Jennings Bryan is that his heart was with the populists, but populists didn't win elections. Democrats won elections, so he was a Democrat whose heart was with the populist camp. He was pro-farmer, he was pro-inflation, he would have liked ideas like bimetallism. Republicans tended to continue to favor gold standard kind of policies. They nominated a traditional businessman named William McKinley. William McKinley had a conservative economic platform. Democrats continued to be divided. They overall, tended to be civilites, but they had a certain amount of gold bugs in them, and the Democratic Party was less certain who they were going to nominate. Although the populists had nominated William Jennings Bryan as their candidate, William Jennings Bryan attended the Democratic National Convention in 1896 because he actually was a Democrat, right? And while he's there, he's at the convention, and he gave an impassioned speech to the delegates about the importance of silver coinage. Now, it's hard to believe that anybody could give an impassioned, rapt speech about monetary policy, but William Jennings Bryan is the man of the day. The speech becomes known as the Cross of Gold speech, and it was so convincing that the Democrats solidly took the bimetalist approach. The speech was also so convincing that the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan to be their presidential candidate. Now, this is a little complicated, but the populists who had nominated Bryan with one presidential candidate. The Democrats also nominated Bryan, but with a different presidential candidate. And the Republicans, they didn't nominate Bryan at all. They nominated William McKinley, entirely different. That meant that if you supported William Jennings Bryan for president, you had to decide, do I support him as a populist or do I support him as a Democrat? It kind of left voters sort of confused on what to do, and Bryan supporters were divided on how they should cast their votes. William Jennings Bryan, I think looking back, should have declined one of those nominations, but he did not. He knew that being a Democrat was his best shot at actually winning election, but the Populist Party was closer to his views. And I think the way I understand the man was that if he would have stepped down from the Populist Party, then the Populist Party probably would have failed, and that's where his heart is, and he just didn't want to do that, so he didn't. And he didn't run on either side. The Democratic Party also splintered, and in some states a break-off group would nominate a gold standard candidate, and so the Democrats really kind of fractured their votes out of it. And in 1896, we set up in a three-way race between William McKinley, William Jennings Bryan, and William Jennings Bryan. And the McKinley campaign runs, I think, what most political scientists consider the first modern campaign in presidential history, where the McKinley campaign was built on a network of people who would campaign on his behalf. William McKinley had powerful business leader votes, kind of the Republican machine, and they would set up sort of like all of the get out the vote campaigns to go support McKinley. McKinley actually almost never left his house. He stayed on his front porch in Canton, Ohio. The Football Hall of Fame is there, like not at McKinley's house, but also in Canton. It's probably more important to us moderns than William McKinley. But he basically just stayed there on his couch. And if people wanted to meet William McKinley or hear him deliver speeches, they would get on a train, they would go to Canton, they would walk from the train station up to his front porch, and he would sit there and he would deliver the stump speech. He would just give the same speech to every group, and they would come out and he would, kiss some hands and shake some babies, and they would go get back on the train and they would leave. And McKinley almost didn't go anywhere. William Jennings Bryan, on the other hand, launched the world's first whistle stop campaign, where he went from town to town riding the back of a railroad car, and he would show up in the town and people would be gathered at the station. They'd go, "Oh, William Jennings Bryan, this captivating orator." He was so great at speaking. Because he was a captivating orator, and he would speak to the crowds and everybody would clap, and then he'd say, "And now we're off to wherever," and then the train would pull out and he would go to the next town and give the same speech and do the exact same thing there. Underfunded campaigns of William Jennings Bryan, it was a fury of speeches, sometimes as many as 20 a day, and he visited 27 of the 45 states in his first whistle stop campaign. William Jennings Bryan won the South. He won the farming Midwest, mostly with the Democratic Party. He had around 6.5 million votes, But McKinley won the East and the industrial parts of the Midwest, driven by rich industrialists who had stoked a fear of an economic collapse if William Jennings Bryan had won office. And he took around 7.1 million votes, but won significantly more electoral college votes. McKinley ended up being elected president as the populist movement collapsed, but its legacy would continue, particularly that the powerless would be able to organize and make a political impact. That idea of the powerless pushing forward political impact, that's going to play out its way on 100 ways of American history, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.